It's funny how things work. We have giant metal vehicles that can fly through the air. We have HD video that you can carry in your pocket. We have music that can be accessed anytime from devices that use touchscreens. But when something like this happens, something so stupid, something so simple, there's nothing to be done. Nothing that can be done, even with our advances. I woke up 3 weeks ago in this place. It's a medium-sized room with concrete walls, floor, and ceiling. In spots, the concrete is stained and cracked. A single light bulb hangs from the ceiling and sometimes flickers. It's not a very powerful bulb, but enough to see. I woke up next to a woman. I didn't recognize her, but that didn't matter. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know how I'd gotten here. There didn't seem to be any doors or windows or openings of any kind. Just a concrete box with me and a sleeping woman in it. I woke her up after a few moments of dazed confusion. She didn't scream, which was my worry, and instead asked questions calmly. "Where are we?" she asked. "I don't know." "How did I get here?" "I don't know." "Who are you?" I smiled. Finally, a question I could answer. "I'm Tom," I said. "Tom Green. I woke up here just a minute ago and I was hoping you might have an idea about it. But since you don't, well, we may as well get acquainted. You know my name. What's yours?" I stuck out my hand. She shook my hand. "I'm Melissa," she replied. "Melissa Dobbs. Last I remember, I was..." She froze and creased her eyebrows. "Did you hear that?" I listened, but didn't hear anything. I shook my head. "What was it?" I asked. "It sounded like, I don't know, a thump?" We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening for another noise. There was nothing but silence as long as we sat there. After so long, I just shook my head. "I don't think there's anything there, Melissa," I said. "But if you did hear a sound, that means we're close to the surface." "The surface?" she repeated. "What do you mean, the surface?" "Well, the way I figure, we're probably underground. Where else would someone keep a concrete box? Another thing I'm wondering is how they even got us in here. It all seems like a dream, you know?" I sighed and leaned my back against the wall. This couldn't be happening. Not really. "I know what you mean," Melissa said. "It just doesn't seem real. This doesn't just happen. This can't just happen. This time, I heard the noise too. It was like a thump, but a squishy thump. Like if you hit an animal with a heavy object. Images of bleeding animals flashed in my mind. Pictures of infants being hit with hammers and baseball bats. I almost jumped. I was so surprised. Why would I think that? That wasn't normal. None of this was normal. This place and that sound and these thoughts. None of this was right. "Did you?" "Yeah, I heard it." I interrupted Melissa. I started to ask if she saw things, but she would think I was crazy. Being here was making me a little stressed, sure, but crazy? No, and I wouldn't let her think that. Melissa and I spent the rest of the day discussing the situation and listening for noises. It seems like they came in regular intervals, once every 10 minutes or so. I thought maybe we were near an automatic machine. Sometimes when the sounds came, I would have the flashes of terrible things. It was disgusting and wrong, but it happened. I couldn't help it. I wondered if Melissa had the flashes, but I didn't dare ask her. If my only companion thought I was crazy, well, I didn't think it would end well. We thought it was some sort of hostage taking at first. We thought we had been taken captive by criminals. That's what we decided. It was a normal assumption. About 30 thumps into the day, though, our thoughts changed. We were hungry. If the thumps really were coming every 10 minutes, Then 30 thumps meant we'd been awake for 5 hours. I could hear my stomach growling, and once I even heard Melissa's. We were thirsty more though. My throat was sore and dry, but we had no water or food. We were talking about what we'd do when we got out of this box if it happened. The interviews and books and maybe even movies would come. We could both get rich off of this. We tried to remain positive like that. Suddenly, everything went black. It felt like only a second, and I didn't realize my eyes had closed until I opened them. Melissa and I woke up at the same time. We were confused. Somehow we'd blacked out at the same time, woken up at the same time. And food, Melissa whispered. There's food and water. She was staring into a corner of the room, where before there'd been nothing. But now, there were 2 trays with food and water on them. My stomach rumbled and I didn't care where they came from or how we'd blacked out. Let's eat, I said, grabbing our trays. We can talk about it in a few thumps. Melissa actually laughed. Funny how the way we measure time can change just like that, she said, grabbing her food. But I guess it's just as good as a minute or even hours. The food was good, warm, steak and potatoes, a scoop of ice cream for dessert, and a liter bottle of water to drink. The steak was pre-cut for us, so no knives. The forks we were given were dull, very dull. No way we could hurt anyone with them. Not that we would be able to regardless, since it seemed like they could induce loss of consciousness whenever they wanted. I got the feeling that once we were done eating, we'd just black out again and the forks and trays would be gone. We ate in silence, and then my guess was confirmed. We lost our tray and our forks, and again, we were just in an empty concrete box. We never actually talked about it. We kept busy talking about other things. After another 50 or so thumps, we went to sleep. It was hard at first to sleep with the thumps, but as with anything, you grow accustomed to it. You grow accustomed to the thumps and the flashes and the blackouts, just as people grow accustomed to planes and phones. This is adaptation. This is evolution. I don't know how long we slept, but every day there seemed to be less and less time in between each thump. Each day, though, the food seemed to get a little better. The first day's food was good, but it seemed bland. Each day the food tasted better, as if a reward for losing time between thumps. This is conditioning. By day 10, there was barely any time between thumps. The food was delicious. We couldn't get enough. Melissa and I got along well enough. We were becoming pretty big friends, and at around day 5, we started having sex. We didn't love each other, but we were both adults. We both wanted something to keep us busy and entertained. Why not sex? Day 12, though, things took a turn. They went bad. We were eagerly awaiting lunch. We were ready for the blackout, ready to delight in the delicious food we'd come to expect. We weren't thinking about escape. We weren't thinking about anything. Thumps, flashes, food. Thumps, flashes, food. The flashes had gotten worse. So much worse. The thumps came so fast now. The flashes were in my head all the time. Babies, flayed open and dead. Dogs, limbs severed and laying in pools of blood. Cats, with their eyes pulled out and their organs ripped from their abdomens. All just animals. Dead animals. Their lives that had been so important before, now useless. Now nothing. Now just a heap of bloody regret. This is my future. This is the death of all. Thump. Darkness. When I awoke, I didn't smell food like I was used to. Melissa was already awake, crying. "What's the matter?" I asked her. "Why are you awake already?" "I didn't fall asleep this time," she whispered. They came in. They came in straight through the wall. They were so hideous. They, She started to sob. "Calm down, Melissa," I said. I went to her and put my arm around her. She latched on to me weakly. "Tell me what happened." "They don't have mouths, Tom," she cried. "They're not human. But the thumps come from their heads. We don't hear them with our ears, Tom. I never noticed before, but we hear them in our heads. Do you understand? They didn't bring food. They said that they'll keep bringing food from now on, but not today. They tried to tell me something else, but they had to stop thumping to talk to me. And once the thumping was gone, I didn't hear. I didn't want to. I begged them to stop, to bring it back. They stopped talking. Then they left." This is necessary. I held Melissa until she stopped crying and fell asleep. I thought about the changes we had now. I was trying to comfort her, but all I could think about was the flashes had stopped. I hadn't realized until that moment, because I was so used to the flashes accompanying the thumps that I had given myself flashes, but they weren't coming anymore. Not really. Something had changed since mealtime, and it made me almost uncomfortable. I could understand Melissa panicking when the thumping stopped now, though I didn't think I would have freaked out that badly. Melissa was still crying. "I'm sorry, Tom," she mumbled, pushing her face into my chest. I could feel her tears seeping through my shirt. "I should have been able to talk to them, but the thumps, it's so strange when they're gone. I'm used to them now." I understood. I understood perfectly. We spent the rest of the day solemnly talking, not about what we could do when we got out, but how we possibly could get out. Things weren't normal. The thought that we might get out was beyond us now. We accepted that. We could live like this, at least for a while. Then one day, maybe in a month or a year, we might use our forks and dig into our wrists. Do they have thumps in heaven or hell or whatever lies beyond? We got food the next day. The thumps continued and the flashes remained silent. The food was better and life was good again. Melissa, though, she was shaken. Maybe it was seeing our captors that had her so on edge. Maybe they put something in her head. The flashes, I thought. Is it possible they left my head and went to hers? Crazy, but crazier things had happened here. Every day, Melissa got more nervous, more agitated. I couldn't understand. I tried to talk to her about it, but she wouldn't answer my questions. She just looked at me and shook her head. "Nothing's wrong," she would say. "I'm just tired." This is denial. It happened on day 20. We fell asleep. We woke up and ate our food. We went about things as usual. I didn't know. If I had, I would have done something. Suffering alone is 1,000 times worse than suffering with a friend. I was finishing my dessert, and Melissa did it as quick as lightning. She stabbed herself hard in one wrist, then the other. Then she shoved it in her mouth. She jammed it in her throat, pulling and pushing and grinding it in there, trying desperately to end her life. One wrist was bright red, but it hadn't drawn blood. The other she'd stabbed harder, much harder, and it had holes in it. The holes were pretty deep, leaking, pouring blood. Blood was trickling out of her mouth. And when I threw my food down and reached out to stop her, she kicked me in the chest. I fell against the wall and she just kept stabbing, cutting, choking with the fork. I didn't even realize I was screaming. The thumps had joined together by this point, making constant noise, and it was hard to hear. Eventually, she slowed and tried to force the fork down her throat. She gagged and choked and retched, but it didn't come out. I got to her and pushed her arms away and reached in, but it was far down at this point. Too far. My only companion. Dying. She died quickly, between the blood and the choking. I don't know what killed her. I didn't care. I cried the rest of that day. I felt like doing the same. I thought maybe I would the next day. Maybe I would join her again. At least I wouldn't be alone. The next day, however, didn't work out like that. I waited and waited. Eventually, the blackout came. I was eager to end my own life after a delightful meal. I just hoped I didn't mess it up. I'd hate to be half dead on the floor, pissing and shitting myself alone, for who knows how long. Fortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to mess it up. I awoke outside. It was dark. This wasn't right. No, I whispered. No one was in sight, but I could see the lights of a town in the distance. I was out. I'd made it out of the concrete prison. No, this is panic. This is change. I'm not ready for this. The thumps were gone, but things had changed. Adaptation, conditioning. The thumps were gone. The flashes were back. Evolution. I wasn't used to the silence. It was driving me mad. The flashes didn't help. I knew what would make the flashes go away though. The thumps. They would keep the flashes at bay, make me comfortable again. That was all I needed. And they'd been teaching me how to make thumps. They'd been teaching me since day one. I just had to. I grimaced, not wanting to think about it, but I needed the thumps. What did I have to lose anyway? My only companion was gone. I stood and headed for the town in the distance. Recall your earliest childhood memory. How old are you in this memory? 4, maybe 5? Developmental neuroscience tells us we do not form episodic memories before the age of 3. Supposedly, memories from before this time are merely phantoms, errors in the brain's memory formation process, ordinary daydreams mislabeled as fact. This is what the current research tells us. It's important you know this. Bear with me, listener. I won't waste your time with endless foreplay. Here's my story. I'm a graduate student studying linguistics. My work often overlaps with that of the neuroscience department, and I have made many contacts there. One such contact is the subject of this story. We'll call him DV. DV is also a graduate student. He studies memory. He uses a procedure called transcranial magnetic stimulation. This procedure uses magnetic radiation to activate targeted portions of the brain. Imagine a magic wand you can point at a cluster of neurons and say, "Dance," and they dance. 2 months ago, DV asked me to assist him in a pet project he was developing. He has assisted me in the past when I was learning to use an EEG for my research. I owed him a great deal. I had no choice but to help him in his work. DV is what I have instead of friends. I arrived at his lab after hours as requested. He was waiting by the door. He was wearing his lab coat. It was far too big for his frame and swallowed his shoulders. He looked so childlike. "Are you ready?" he asked. He had not told me any details about his project. "I just need practicing focusing the machine," he said. "I'm targeting an area of the brain no one has targeted with this device before." I consented. With a little hesitation, he had happily served as my model subject when I was learning the EEG. Academia is built upon exchange of favors. Besides, his machine doesn't even break the skin. I made myself comfortable in his examination chair. It had leather wrist restraints, but they were never used. I was facing a bay window. The lab was high on the campus hill. The night loomed heavy over the orange city lights. A few cars floated along the highway. "Now just try to relax," DV said. His breath was minty, with undercurrents of gin. He turned on the magic wand, and I felt the familiar buzz of electricity on my scalp. The vibrations converged on points just behind my ears, on both sides of my head. The points began to burn. My hair stood on end. "How do you feel?" DV asked. He was whispering, but his voice was thick with anticipation. I think he already knew the answer to his question. Before I could respond, I heard a cry from down the hall. Someone was screaming in the stairwell. Someone was howling like an animal shot through the leg. I heard flesh cracking, heard tendons popping. I heard a voice choking on words. Someone was vomiting up my name in the stairwell. "I think I need to take a break," I said. I tried to turn to look at DV, but felt hands holding my head in place. I tried to move my hands, but found the wrist straps had been fastened. "How long have I been here?" I asked. No one responded. The moaning down the hall grew closer. Someone was pounding on the doors. They were locked, but the door to the lab wasn't. "Please, turn it off," I said. The current from the machine felt like lightning coursing behind my eyes. The window grew larger. The cars on the road skidded out of control. I watched headlights careen into each other. The city lights blinked out, one by one. The darkness on the landscape was so thick. I could wade into it. So I did. I was out there, in the void. There was more distance before me than the Earth's horizon provides. I was alone, for a precious instant. Then, the darkness was broken by a man. He was the man from the hall. He was a man without skin, muscles and sinew all twitching, veins and arteries all spurting. I could see his heart shrivel in his chest when he looked at me. He was all slaughterhouse, no humanity. He was so close. I could smell the rotten meat on his silver bones. "Do you remember me?" he said. His teeth were gripped out like a racehorse. His frame was blurry, as if dislodged in time. His mouth looked like a slow exposure photo of a burning carcass. "Yes," I said, because I did. When I was young, too young to form memories, I had a dream. In this dream, a man walked behind me and told me things about the universe I didn't want to know. He was a man without skin. He was the man standing before me in the void. He followed me through the movie theaters, through city parks, through howling tunnels and unkempt forests and childhood homes, only to find me huddled in the corner of my bedroom closet. He spoke a few words. I don't have words for the things he said. I woke up soon after, drenched in freezing sweat, lips burned with vomit, eyes sore from rolling in their sockets. My mind tried to reject the memory. I have searched every language for the words I heard that night, but no tongue of man has ever spoke the things I heard. They're in the void. They're in the lab. The man had found me again. The machine fractured my defense, and I let him in. For the second time, he spoke those words, and for the second time, my mind refused to keep them. At some point, what seemed like an eternity later, DV removed the device from my head. As sudden as waking from a dream, I came to my senses. "How long was I hooked up for?" I asked. "Less than a minute," DV responded. He had lost his tone of knowing. His voice was quiet and trembled as he spoke. "Untie me," I said. I then realized my wrists were not bound. DV was frozen in the corner. I stood up and gathered my belongings. My ears were ringing, each in different pitch. They were dissonant. They were the last notes of a song I hadn't heard in 20 years. "I'm not coming back," I said. "Please don't contact me." DV nodded. His skin was as white as his lab coat. I walked the 5 miles to my home. I didn't trust myself behind the wheel of a car. The night was silent as I walked. Even the crickets were quiet for me. When I got home, I vomited into the bathroom sink. I watched my breakfast, lunch, and dinner circle the sputtering drain. I looked into the mirror. My shirt was drenched in blood, except for a pattern of ribs across the front. My blood was still wet to the touch. My pockets were full of cartilage. My socks were soaked in afterbirth. I threw my clothes in the trash compactor that night. DV and I do not speak. I do not see him on campus. I complete my schoolwork regularly. I pay my rent on time. I fall asleep to talk shows on weeknights and to whiskey on weekends. I don't do too much dreaming nowadays. I especially don't think about my childhood. Somewhere, in the unfathomable recess of inaccessible memory, there are words that shouldn't be heard. A man without skin chose to tell me those words, and I choose twice now not to remember them. At the beginning of this text, I asked you to recall your first memory. I hope it was from when you were 4 or 5. I hope it was a simple memory of your first injury or something similar. I hope these things, because somewhere in your brain, there is a memory of something your developed brain chose not to remember. I hope these things, because the infinite horror of those forgotten words is too great for the human mind to comprehend. I hope your dreams are blissful, and your nightmares leave you happy to be awake. Most of all, I hope that this story keeps you from exploring those damning and boundless vaults of your mind. When we are born, we have no defense against the world, physical or mental. Perhaps it takes a few years to build these defenses. Perhaps the things we see before then are better left forgotten. Every city claims to have them, and every city will tell you that theirs is the best. Most larger places will lay claim to having quite a few. I am of course speaking of secret bars, the kind of bars with no name out front, where a secret password is required to get in. This is what started my obsession, and may have cost me my soul. The year was 2001. I had turned 21 earlier that year, and had already done up all the new freedoms that come with that age. I had done bars, casinos, you name it. At first, it was so cool, because for years I had felt like a kid, like some wet behind the ears idiot that the rest of the world just patted on the head. Even after turning 21, things remained annoying. People would hear that I was 21 and treat me not like an adult, but as a new adult. Like a grown-up that still needed grown-ups. I was annoyed. I worked downtown in a dreary office job, inputting data. The nice thing about it though were my hours, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. For a single guy in his early 20s, it was perfect. I got to sleep in every day, and I would get off work just in time to take a quick walk from the New Orleans Central Business District, cross over Canal Street, and bam! I was in the middle of the French Quarter, land of booze and women. Lots of fun times were spent down there. But as I said, even that began to get boring, really boring. So, I began to research secret bars. I found a few right away, and most of them were just as boring as the regular bars. One in particular, called Mythique, was located up a narrow stairwell, accessible only through a tiny door located under the bar downstairs. Once I got up there though, it was just another bar. The clientele was a bit more pretentious. Most of them thought they were the second coming of Lestat. But in the end, it was just the same thing. A bar, drinks, people, and the usual crappy music. I remember one night, I was at home in my tiny apartment, using Metcrawler. Remember, this is 2001, and searching for more secrets in my city that I was now old enough to exploit. I kept finding links to the same boring places I always went to. Then my email binged, or should I say announced, "You've got mail." I clicked open my email and saw the heading for the message read, "Secret Bar." Now, I was sure if I had asked anyone on my AOL buddy list for help, and I didn't recognize the sender. I figured maybe I was in a chat room one night and asked around, but I figured it was worth a check. The email was simple and short, and read something like this: "Secret New Orleans Bar. Looking for a journey? Not afraid of hell? Not too shy for heaven? Then come visit us. Be in Jackson Square tonight at 2 a.m. Wear a black shirt and gray pants. And have a cup of coffee in your hand. Seat yourself in the third bench. This is your only invitation. Miss it and you will never be invited again. P.S. Come alone. Tell no one." That was the end of the email. I was lucky that my job required me to wear a suit, because it just so happened that I had a pair of gray slacks. I put on a black shirt and realized that I actually looked pretty good. I figured this could be a prank, but even if it was, even if it turned out to be nothing, I would go out and have a few drinks anyway, maybe even get laid. I didn't have to go into work the next day, so this night could turn out to be fun anyway. However, I may have been a bored, idiotic 21-year-old, but I wasn't totally stupid. This could also be a trick, a trap, or something worse. So, I called my best friend Mike up. I told him that I was going out with some strangers from work, and that I wasn't sure about them. I told him I would call him by 4 a.m., and if I didn't, for him to call and check up on me. I told him I would be in the quarter. Mike had to be up for work at 4 a.m., so it wouldn't put him out of his way to call me when he got up. I left my apartment at around 1:30 a.m. I lived about 15 minutes away from downtown, but I figured I would make sure I was on time. By 1:55 a.m., I was sitting on the third bench in Jackson Square, sipping on my coffee and waiting. At 2 a.m., the cathedral bells rang out twice, and I received a tap on the shoulder. A gorgeous woman was sitting next to me, and I thought to myself, this is too cliché to be real. To me, she seemed like a walking cliché of a hidden bar. Goth girl, mid-20s, really hot. Yeah, she was from the bar. I knew it from the start. "I'm Jody," said the woman. "Well, at least you're not Raven or Death or Lilith or some other stereotypical goth name," I replied, but I did so with a smile. She returned my smile with one of her own. "Nope, always have been, Jody. And you must be Kurt, right?" She knew my name. Very cool. Of course, my name was on the AOL profile where the email was sent, so if this was her attempt at a cool trick, I was one step ahead. "Yep, Kurt, that's me. I guess you're here to show me to the secret bar?" I asked. "Only if you're ready to journey to hell, or heaven, depending on your taste. We like to consider this to be the first back out point for new clients. You can decline the invitation now and go home, or to some other bar, or wherever you'd like. Only be warned that no other invitation will ever come to you again." I considered this and decided that it was already after 2 a.m. I was out, dressed up and full of coffee. I wanted to see this place. "Lead on, Miss Jody," I replied. She stood up and began to walk ahead of me, at a rapid pace I might add. We walked in silence for some time, weaving deep into the quarter, past Bourbon Street, past all the loud and drunk tourists, past the warm and safe lights, the cop cars, the music from the bars. Before long, we were in the dark part of the quarter, mostly residential, and very few people were on the streets this way. She suddenly stopped and walked up to the stoop to a private residence. She fiddled with the keys, opened the door, and gestured for me to enter. "Wait, is this someone's house?" I asked. This is the house where the dead scream in silence, where the walls rot, where pain becomes pleasure, where pleasure becomes death. This is the house of Din, he who dwells on the Black Star. Enter. I thought this was the coolest pitch for a bar I had ever heard. I figured it was rehearsed, but she said the whole little phrase with a lot of conviction. I had no idea who Din was, and I certainly didn't know about black stars, but I did have a desire to push on. She walked me into the house, which was empty. No furniture, no nothing. Now, French Quarter real estate isn't cheap, so if this place was renting a house just to serve as a cover for a bar, they clearly took themselves seriously. This might not be so boring after all. What happened next was strange. She turned towards a small hallway with an elevator. Now, I know that some houses back in the day had elevators. However, this one only appeared to go down. New Orleans isn't exactly known for having basements, especially in homes. As I went to step in, she stopped me once more. This is your second back out chance. Same as before. You can turn around and leave. No harm, no foul. Push the button, I replied, pointing at the down button, and stepped in. The elevator ride felt long, really long. At first, I was thinking that this was impossible. No one builds down in this city. Hell, we even have to bury our dead above the ground. As far as I could see though, we were going down. This was one of those older elevators with just the metal grate door. I could see wood and metal going past us, and this eventually gave way to stone. I was about to question this when it occurred to me. Cool trick, I said. Trick? Jody asked. Yeah, the elevator is rumbling in place while a rolling graphic goes by outside to look like we're going down. Right? Because, while I'm no expert on elevators, I would say we'd have to be at least 20 stories below the city right now. And I know that just isn't possible. You're right, she replied, grinning. We aren't 20 stories below the city. We are, by now, at least 2,000 stories below, if you're using stories as a measurement. I wanted to say something back about how that was a lie. Had to be a lie. We hadn't been riding that long, and that amount of depth wasn't possible on a tiny elevator like this. However, I figured this was all part of the act, like her whole speech about the House of Din and all that crap. I didn't want to become too obnoxious or pushy. She might end up asking me to leave, figuring I would ruin the scene for the other patrons. Instead, I just smiled and decided to play along with a really cool and elaborate bar scene. Fake or not, this was by far the most ambitious effort I had ever seen put forward for a drinking establishment. Shortly after, the elevator stopped. Jody stepped in front of the doors, but before she opened them, she turned back to me. This is your final chance to back out. If you wish, I will take you back. However, once I open these doors, you will be in hell. You may find your way back to the surface tonight, but some find that leaving is just impossible. Some stay forever. In the interest of free will and fair play, I am bound by the Council of Nod to offer you this final chance to return to your life. Choose now. Amazing speech, Jody, I replied. Really great. You guys clearly put some thought into this. Yes, I want to go to this bar. She smiled and opened the doors. A small door sat at the end of a wooden hallway that looked like it may have been built around the time of the pyramids. There were no lights. I could only see by the small electric light in the elevator and the light coming from the door ahead. I walked forward, and as soon as I stepped off the elevator, the heat hit me. I wasn't so hot that I couldn't take it, but if anyone has ever experienced being in an attic on a really hot day with no ventilation, then you'll have an idea of how this felt. The air was thick beyond description. I instantly was covered in sweat, and I knew that if I stayed in this hallway for too long, I would surely pass out. I turned to look back and saw the elevator already heading back up. From what I could see, there was no button to call it back down either. I guess Jody wasn't kidding when she said that was my last chance to back out. I crossed my fingers that the bar would be air conditioned and walked forward into the light. What happened over the next couple hours is largely a blur. I will tell it as best I can. I entered that bar. It was small, very small, about the size of a bedroom. There was a single wooden bar, 3 bar stools pushed up to it, and 3 small tables in the corner area. The room was poorly lit. Only a small light bulb hanging from the cord was providing the light. However, it was well lit enough to see everything, and sitting right on the bulb seemed most logical. There was a small shelf behind the bar, typical setup, liquor bottles in front of a mirror. There were 5 others in the room, plus the bartender. I saw a gothic girl sitting at one of the tables, sipping a drink with a rather plain-dressed man. There were 2 gentlemen at the other table. One was wearing a business suit. The other was wearing that awful cowboy attire that was popular in almost every walk of life, even secret bars. There was another woman, average in appearance, probably in her mid-30s, smoking at the other side of the bar. Of course there was me too. So that completed our little circle. There was no music playing. The walls were old wood, oak maybe. The bartender, now he was a classic. White shirt, black pants, suspenders, and a bow tie. Like something out of the roaring 20s. It was still hot too. Nothing as bad as the hallway, but pretty awful. Liquor would only make me hotter, but I was here now. I figured I would at least test the waters. Now, as far as liquor, I saw no bottles that I could recognize. None were labeled. There was no beer either. No name brands, no cash register, no bar mat. This place was as simple as you could want. After a moment, the bartender spoke to me. "Welcome to hell," he announced, smiling. Cool name, sort of expected it though. I tried not to sound rude or pretentious. They had put on a great show tonight, but calling the place hell? Really? Too predictable. Well, it translates differently in a lot of places. Hell is just the way you know it. Shall I call it something else? He asked, and he didn't seem to be joking or annoyed. No, hell is fine. How about a drink? Jack and Coke, please, I said. No Jack here, and no Coke either, he answered at once. What do you have then? I asked. Well, most people down here have a drink we call regret. I can also serve you loneliness. Or if you're feeling particularly bold, our house special is damnation. Wow, you guys really are playing up the whole hell thing. Okay, serve me some regret, please. He handed me a drink poured from a brown bottle. It tasted amazing too. I figured it to be bourbon and wished I had some Coke to mix it with. Apparently there was no ice here. I chuckled. Of course not. Ice in hell? What am I thinking? The drink was tasty though, and the buzz hit me quick. I ordered up a loneliness and began to look around at my fellow patrons. None of them seemed to even notice me. The goth girl was cute though, so I picked up my drink and decided to walk over to her. When suddenly, the woman sitting at the bar began to whimper. I'm so thirsty. Can I please have some water? She seemed to be pleading this to the bartender. No ma'am, he replied with that same stupid grin. No water in hell, not even a small amount. Have another cigarette though. Wash it down with some hard liquor. No more smoking. My mouth is too dry. No more liquor. Water, please. She continued, and to me, it began to sound a lot like begging. Instead of handing her water, he held out an unlit cigarette. It was then that I noticed the overflowing ashtray, the size of a damn punch bowl, sitting next to her. It was full of butts, had to be over 1,000 of them in there. Had she smoked all of them herself? I strained my eyes and studied her harder. Her lips were blistered badly. She had been at it for a while. The bartender patiently held out a cigarette, grin never leaving his face, until she finally sighed and took it. He produced a lighter and she took a drag. She began to cough violently, gagging too. I decided to chime in. Hey man, she doesn't look too hot, and I really don't think she needs another smoke. She looks like she's dying of thirst too. Call the elevator, man. I think she's had enough. The bartender turned his big smile on me. Who? Old Nancy here? Nah, Nancy's a trooper, man. Smokes a couple packs a day. And as far as her thirst, well, she knew this place was a thirsty sort of dive before she walked into the door. But she wanted to be here. She is getting exactly what she wanted. I walked over to Nancy and placed my hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, if you want to get out of here, I'll walk you over to the elevator. You don't look so great right now. I tried to sound as concerned as a 21-year-old kid could. Nancy looked at me and smiled. Oh, I'm fine. Just fine, she said, but her mouth quivered as she spoke. The bartender was watching us like a hawk, still smiling, but his smile no longer looked so friendly. Everything okay? He asked, beaming like a used car salesman. Nancy shakily replied yes. The bartender turned around, and in that second, Nancy gripped my arm hard, pulled me into the smog that was her breath and whispered, "Leave while you can," so low that I almost missed it. Her breath was like a chimney. She must have been chain smoking for days. I smoked, and so do most of my friends. And even on nights where we would chain smoke and pound booze until the sun rose, none of us were ever that toxic. I walked over to the man in the business suit. He at least appeared sane. Hey sir, I think that lady over there needs help, I said to him. The man looked at me and laughed. We all need help here, kid. We're in hell after all, he shouted. As he did this, I looked over at the goth girl, just in time to see her begin to cut herself, deep and hard from the looks of it. The plain-dressed man sitting next to her began to laugh in a high-pitched tone, almost a giggle, and that was when I noticed that he was masturbating. Only, not in the sense that we all do at home. No, his member was raw, bloody, torn away in places, but he just kept going at it. Stop that! Look at what you're doing to yourselves! I screamed at them. They looked at me and I noticed that the girl was crying, but also smiling. Her eyes were practically begging to her self-inflicted pain to stop, yet she just kept cutting. I had seen enough. I reached over and attempted to pull the knife out of her hand. Just then, I felt a strong grip on my shoulder, stronger than anything I had ever felt in my life. It was the bartender. He had come around the bar to grab me. No, no, sir, he screamed into my ear. Every patron of hell gets to enjoy their treats without judgment. After all, judgment has already been passed. We exist beyond that now. Let her cut. She loves it after all. Can't you see she loves it? She's smiling ear to ear. The bartender dragged me back to my stool, and with great speed, was somehow back behind the bar again. Now, you wanted secrets, right, Kurt? You were bored and wanted more. That is what you came for. Now drink your drink before I beat your fucking face in. Through all of this, he never stopped smiling. He slammed a glass before me. A murky liquid was inside. He grabbed my arm and began to squeeze, the pain becoming unbearable. My mind began to race. This was no bar. This was something, but not a bar. I wasn't ready to believe I was actually in hell, but I knew I was somewhere bad. Drink your drink, sir, he screamed again, and fearing that I would pass out from the pain, I slammed down the liquid in front of me. It tasted horrible. I couldn't describe it then, and I can't now, but it was fierce. He let go of me, and suddenly the room got much hotter. The light began to flicker, and suddenly, I was afflicted by knowledge. Things I didn't want to know, things that no one would want to know. My mother had an affair, and the man I had grown up calling my dad was in fact not my father at all. I had a brother who died. I never knew that. My boss at work hated me. My grandfather ended his life. After all these years, I just thought he died naturally. My mother was going to abort me, but changed her mind because she couldn't afford the abortion. I was going to die alone. My wife, a woman I would meet in 6 years and fall madly in love with, she would die in a car crash with my 3-year-old son in the back seat. There was nothing I could do to change this. I would go blind in my 60s from a work-related accident. There were currently 34 people in the world right now, some who I thought of as friends, who wanted me to die. They hated me. No one, not my mother, not my father, no one had ever loved me at all. Those were just a few of the secrets that had suddenly hit me. There were thousands, maybe millions more. But by then, my mind couldn't process them all. There were some things about me, things about people I knew, that were so dark that I'm thankful that I couldn't remember them, because to dwell on them for even a second longer, that would have driven me to madness. Frantically, I looked around the bar. The woman Nancy, who was still smoking, only her throat was on fire. A small red glow smoldering right in the middle of her throat. She was clearly in the worst pain of her existence, but she continued to take puff after puff of her cigarette. Each time she did, the glow of her throat would get brighter. I looked straight ahead into the mirror behind the bar, seeing the gore fest that had begun behind me. However, what took my attention was the small black figure standing directly to my right. It was maybe 5 feet tall. Its skin was jet black. The only thing that stood out was its eyes. They were human eyes, but bright, not glowing, just bright enough to stand out from the onyx of its face. It had small horns on its head. It had very white, very sharp teeth. Somehow, I knew this was Dan, and I was in his house. I looked towards the door, but it was gone. The heat continued to get worse. The secrets were still popping up into my mind, each worse than the one before. Entire dimensions of my soul were being revealed to me, all of it horrible. Just then, my cell phone rang. The ringtone, something from my world, something from up above. It grabbed my attention, and in that moment, the secret slowed down a bit. I looked down. It was 4 a.m. Mike. Mike was calling to check up on me. His name, Mike. Yes, I have a friend named Mike, my best friend. The more I focused on things that were real, the more stable things became around me. The secrets were almost stopping now. The macabre scene around me was slowing down too. Nancy was back to just smoking again. The goth girl wasn't cutting. That sinister face of Din, it had also retreated just a bit. Mike, my oldest friend. Yes, we grew up together. We rode our bikes together. We had sleepovers, pizza parties. And the more I focused on the real world, if I could just... The door was back. I bolted for it. "Stop! You had your chance to back out," screamed the bartender, and I looked back just in time to see him leap over the bar behind me. I shot through the door and back into the tiny, impossibly hot hallway. The bartender burst through the doors, and I did the only thing I could think of. If thinking about the real world weakened this place, then perhaps a real link to the world would break it. I hit answer on my cell phone, and the voice of my best friend who was calling from the safety of his apartment, it pleasantly greeted my ears. I could even hear music in the background. Real music. "Mike, call the cops. I'm in real trouble here," I screamed into the phone. "What? I can barely hear you, man. Your connection sucks," he answered. The bartender was still coming, still grinning. I had one last idea. I pushed speaker. Mike's voice, a product of the living world, owned by someone who had not made a deal to enter some level of hell, flooded the hallway. The bartender stopped. He is not allowed to know of this place, to have any contact without being invited, even voice contact. It violates the Council of Nod. That was when the final blow to the bar from hell was delivered. I heard Mike, in his sleepy yet concerned voice, say, "What is the Council of Nod?" Contact had been made. Whatever rules governed this place had been broken. Suddenly, the elevator came down. The bartender, still smiling, looked down at me. "Sorry, sir, but you have violated the rules. You are no longer welcome at this bar. Please leave." Jody was standing in the elevator. I stood up and climbed in. The effects of the drink I consumed were gone. No more secrets. My phone had died. I guess calling from hell drains a battery. However, the effects were enough. We rode up in silence. When we reached the surface, Jody walked me out of the house, onto the stoop. Then she spoke. "You may think you have won tonight, but you didn't. You had a chance to ride this elevator up, as well as down. Your heart wanted secrets instead of happiness, though, so it went down. You could have gone up, and everything you could ever have possibly desired would have been yours. So, go on. Feel proud, like the proud mortal. We like proud mortals, because the proud ones always find their way back to hell." "Fuck you, Jody," I replied, but did so as I was walking away. I didn't want to tempt these people any more than I had. When I got home that night, I remembered almost all the secrets. Over the years, they have slipped away, slowly at first, then, like a dream. I would wake up and more would be lost. I wrote down the ones that I listed here, because I didn't want to forget them all. However, when I read them now, they don't seem like secrets anymore, just like weird lies. Of course, I called the police the very next day. I wanted to help those people down there. I had to dress up the story a bit. I told the cops that I was led there by Jody after meeting her in the quarter. I left out the part about the place possibly being a level of hell, and simply described it as a basement where people were being tortured. The cops got a warrant and went in. The house was empty, as I said it was. However, there was no elevator found. The cops said there was a large elevator that appeared to have had an old elevator at one time, but it was long gone now. The house itself was still on the market. It had no owner. For a few years, I would go down to Jackson Square around 2 a.m., hoping to catch Jody luring another victim into the house. However, I never saw her again. Years went on. I did marry, and no, my wife was never killed in a car accident. We don't have kids yet, though. Perhaps when I violated the contract, the Council of Nod, or whatever, I somehow broke that process. I'll never know, but I will be careful. After I posted this, I burned the list of secrets that I had written down. Of course, I could always read them on here, but I won't. And in time, hopefully I will forget them too. I never confronted my mother about the abortion plan, or asked who my real dad was. Those secrets seem so real, but Satan is also called the father of lies for a reason. I'm not sure if Din is Satan, or just a lesser version of him, but I doubt that Din is a very honest sort either. I post this as a warning though, a warning to be careful when seeking out secrets. Some things are kept secret for a reason, and to know them is to know madness. The year was 2002. I was a young man who had become detached from a tour group in the midst of the Australian outback. After a few hours, I started to succumb to dehydration. I was envisioning a plodding labored death in the heart of nowhere, but that didn't happen. It seemed like a mirage, but the moon spoke to me, looking upon me with far-flung craters, which felt like remote eyes. The talking rock said it could save me. I followed a misty moonlit trail across the arid landscape, and I eventually stumbled onto the town I'd been trying to find. Later that night in my hotel bed, the moon called to me. It offered 3 wishes. I rushed to the window, confused as to how my replenished body now fed and watered, could still be hallucinating. And yet, I somehow knew that it was real. I knew the moon had saved me from the desert. What do I have to lose by making some wishes to find out? So, I wished for 3 things: money, safety, and health. The creature had many conditions, but I heeded the warnings from every story I had ever been told about both genial and ghoulish genies. The moon made the parameters of its wish granting quite clear. No wishing for more wishes, no wishing for more wish granters, no wishing for things to give to other people, no wishing for anything that would contradict the laws of your natural realm. The ideal wishes seemed obvious. Money. More money than anyone could ever need. Obviously, I couldn't shower loved ones with wealth. I kept my job to support my family, but I used the riches to support my own needs. There's always a catch with wishing. Becoming the wealthiest man on earth will make me a target. When I realized that, I had the idea for my second wish: safety. I was not asking for security beyond the laws of nature. I simply wanted assurance that my financial safety net, if it were ever discovered, would be protected. But what about security against the passage of time? I can't wish for immortality. I can employ the world's greatest doctors, of course, but that's not enough. My final wish was health. I specified to the moon that I was simply talking about safeguards which would abide by the laws of nature. For example, if I had a genetic proclivity towards developing certain diseases, either physical or mental, perhaps the wish granter could provide a cure. Perhaps the moon could simply conjure a cure for every ailment that could ever face a human being. The rock conceded that, even if there were no cure for certain illnesses, it could provide a solution of every health problem that might befall a human being. The moon couldn't make me live forever, but it could ensure that I live for an absurdly long time. I thought I'd covered all the bases. I truly believed I'd outsmarted some sort of deity. I was a fool. I never should have made any wishes, but I certainly shouldn't have made the third wish. 20 years after my Australian encounter, my wealthy and healthy life took a sour turn. The moon ensured me that there would always be a cure in place for any ailment I would face. It had abolished my mental illness, thanks to a wondrous pill that I wasn't permitted to share with others. So, this November, I wasn't fazed when my doctor gave me a harrowing diagnosis. Congestive heart failure, the woman tentatively said. Not to worry, I thought. The wish granter will fix it. It gave me a pill for my mental well-being, and I'm sure it'll give me a new heart too. Perhaps it'll simply grow one for me. I waited. Like a werewolf in a kennel, I howled at the unresponsive moon for attention. Nothing. After weeks without solution, I started to feel consumed by dread. Has it forgotten about me? The wishes were supposed to apply to the rest of my life. Then, one night, the moon arrived. It didn't speak from the sky this time. It spoke from the darkness of my house. A floorboard groaned in the far corner of the living room, heart thumping rhythmically against my rib cage. I found myself staring into the depths of my living room's darkened corner. Something was watching me. The direful creature I hadn't seen for 20 years. It had no eyes or discernible shape, but it had awful white lips, which glowed like a deformed moon in the night sky. Fear gripped me. It's you, I croaked. There's a waiting list for heart transplants, but I thought you'd have some means of speeding things up, I replied, trembling at the hidden thing in the corner of my room. Yes, I must grant your desire. It is my only purpose, the moon mouth maliciously whispered. A wish is a contract. I will find you a heart. Before the creature evaporated, its white lifeless lips curled upwards into a malevolent grin. The almost human expression. It filled me with the feeling of terror which cannot sufficiently translate to words. Suddenly, I realized the dread in my heart was more than dread. Oh fuck, I thought as I clutched my chest. It's happening. An invisible blade twisted into my heart, and I felt my body seize. Blackness swallowed my surroundings. My vision faded. Just one more time, I remember thinking. Let me see Wendy and Macy one more time. When I woke, I was in a hospital room. My chest felt light. It was the healthiest I'd felt in weeks. Wendy was sitting at my bedside, tears flooding her vacant eyes, and a smile was forcefully painted on her pale face. "You're awake," my wife whispered. I smiled. "Hello, sweetheart. I must have given you a scare. I feel much better now, though." She sobbed and squeezed my hand with tremendous strength. There was love in that squeeze, but there was also rage. Inconsolable rage. "They did it, honey. They gave you. You." She moaned like a wounded animal. "You have a new heart." That explained the lightness in my chest, but it didn't explain the fear on my wife's face. Her agonized expression haunted me. Why is she so distraught? I wondered, shuddering. "Wendy," I whispered. "What's Macy?" My wife interrupted, now bawling. "This evening, she was in an accident. She didn't." Wendy didn't need to finish any of her sentences. I knew what happened to our daughter. I knew whose heart was in my chest. I knew what the moon had done to grant my wish. For context, I'm a middle-aged man who lives on the outskirts of Pearbold, a small English village. My house is the only one on a long winding country road, but it does have a bus stop. From my bedroom window, I can see it on the other side of the road. It's quite handy, really. I never miss the morning bus to work, and I know the schedule by heart. That's why I was bewildered when I first noticed the 3:17 bus on a Saturday, October 14th. It woke me up, actually. I'm a light sleeper. I sat upright in bed, twisted my body around, propped myself up on my knees, and gingerly inched the curtains open. The old lamppost on my road illuminated an ominous, fully gray non-branded single-decker bus. There was no interior lighting. I couldn't see a driver or any passengers. Now, this was obviously bizarre. Buses don't show up at that time in the morning. Not in this country. Not in any town or city I know of. Anyway, still, I assumed, as any person would, that times were changing. It seemed like a good idea. A bus for those who have missed the last train home after a night out, perhaps. That still didn't entirely make sense because very few people use my bus stop. It's a 10-minute walk from here to anywhere. I checked the schedule. Nothing. There was a bus at 11:07 p.m. on Friday evening, and there shouldn't have been another one until 6 a.m. on Saturday morning. I watched the vehicle pull away and considered, perhaps, that it wasn't a public bus. Maybe it was a hired coach. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. I put it out of my mind and went back to sleep. However, it returned the next morning, and it continued to do so for weeks. Again, I checked the schedule. Still no mention of a 3:17 a.m. bus. I called the council, and they assured me that it wasn't a public bus. They said that I could contact the local authorities to report any suspicious activity. So, I rang the police. They didn't care. They passed me over to some civil department with a forgettable name, and that department passed me over to another department. Nobody was concerned. It became clear that each person I contacted just wanted me to tire of the whole thing and stop bothering them. I gave up on seeking help, but I didn't give up on my quest for an answer. I started making notes. The bus always arrived at exactly 3:17 a.m. It would linger for approximately 30 seconds. Nobody ever boarded or departed the vehicle. I took a picture of it and posted it on various forums. Nobody could identify the origin of the faceless gray bus, but one comment did stand out. I remember the user telling me that I should sell my house and move. They said that the bus was there for me. Most importantly, they said that I shouldn't, under any circumstances, board it. That seemed like a rather obvious piece of advice. I wasn't planning on boarding any sketchy unlisted bus in the pitch black hours of the morning. But everything changed on November 20th. The bus arrived on time, 3:17 a.m. I knelt on my bed and peeked at it through the curtains as it rounded the corner. Something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Once the vehicle had rolled to a complete stop, I heard it. Somebody on the bus was screaming. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Silence followed, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew I'd heard that scream. I watched the bus and waited. 30 seconds passed. A lot of time passed. When I finally peeled my eyes from the road to check my phone, it was 3:29 a.m. The bus hadn't moved. The world outside was still eerily quiet. I reattached myself to reality and started dialing 999. The call kept failing, and then I saw that I had no signal. None. I usually had signal at my house. I was freaking out, so I got up to turn on my bedroom light. Nothing. I flicked the switch back and forth. No power. The story was the same throughout the house. I was about to head to the fuse box, but I looked out of my living room window, only to see a blackened world. The lamppost was dead. It had to be a power outage. That was when I finally understood, for the first time in my 10 years of solitary living, that I was truly isolated. I had no neighbors, no friends, no family. I was all alone. The gravity of the situation dawned on me. I would have to leave the house. My self-preservation instinct was to stay indoors, but I knew I couldn't ignore the disembodied scream that had echoed through the night. I knew that it had come from the bus. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I were to dismiss it. Armed with a winter coat and a wind-up torch, I bravely ventured into the night. Locking my door behind me, I tentatively strolled down my front path, stopping at the gate to cast the torchlight onto the other side of the road. It revealed the gray, stationary, seemingly abandoned bus. There were no signs of life. Everything was so quiet. I swore to myself that I could hear my heartbeat in my eardrums. I swung the creaky gate open and began to cross the road, futilely attempting to steady my quaking knees. My torch wobbled in my shaky left hand, so I clasped my wrist with my right hand. I shone the light into the windows of the parked vehicle. There was definitely no driver, but it was an elevated coach, so I couldn't see whether there was any passengers. I walked around the front of the vehicle, summoning the courage to enter it. When I reached the other side of the bus, I stood still. I tried to control my breathing. I eyed the doors for what seemed like an eternity, and then I felt my entire body clench. The doors opened. My torchlight wasn't revealing a driver. I couldn't see or hear anyone. I thought for a brief moment of that internet stranger who told me not to board the bus, but I couldn't get the scream out of my head. My gut told me that somebody was in danger. I stepped onto the bus and started to climb the stairs. The doors closed. I held the torch before me, as if it were a weapon, and I gradually climbed the next set of stairs to the elevated passenger platform. I spent several seconds on each step, savoring what I felt could be my final moments on Earth. Then, I illuminated the passenger area before me. I half expected to see nothing. No, there was somebody on the bus. The young girl was sitting on the middle seat of the back row. Her head was in her palms. She was crying. I couldn't see her face. "Are you okay?" I asked timidly. No answer, so I started to walk forwards. I didn't know whether there was anyone else on board, but I couldn't leave her. Once I was standing only a few yards in front of her, I knelt down in the aisle. "Are you okay?" I asked for the second time. The girl's crying abruptly ceased, but she didn't lift her head from her hands. "You shouldn't have boarded this bus," she replied. My torch died. I furiously wound the lever at the side, but it didn't spring back to life. The girl and I had been plunged into darkness. Then, I heard the bus doors open. I slowly turned my head to face the front of the bus. I could hear the sound of low guttural breathing. It was followed by clunking footsteps. Dim moonlight shone through the front window, but it was sufficient to display a hulking figure at the other side of the aisle. A black specter with gangly limbs was moving towards us. He hunched forwards, and his elongated arms dragged along the top of the seats. He was too tall and too wide to fit in the aisle. I turned to face the girl. She had lifted her head from her hands. I could barely hear her. "This is the last stop," she whispered. "I was really hoping you wouldn't board. I wanted more time." Before I could even comprehend what was happening, I felt an icy limb coil itself around my ankle. It yanked, and I fell. My nose connected with the floor of the aisle, and I heard something crack. I thought that was it. I thought that was the end. But I looked up to see the demonic creature coil its other limb around the girl's neck. It hoisted her from her seat. She screamed as she was lifted towards the indistinguishable figure in the aisle. I couldn't really see what happened in the darkness, but I'll never forget the sound her body made when it was consumed by the black entity. It sounded like leaves crunching beneath walking boots. I had almost entirely lost my sense of reality at this point, but some vestige of survival instinct persisted in my fractured mind. I twisted onto my back and looked down at my ankle. I couldn't really see what I was doing in the dark. I just knew I had to act. So with my free foot, I stomped on the creature's limb. I stomped as hard as humanly possible. The demon, which had been devouring the poor girl, unleashed an inhuman wail. It pierced my eardrums and shattered every window on the bus. The limb retracted from my ankle and returned to the shadowy being. I seized my opportunity, catapulting to my feet. I spun around and lunged for the now glassless back window of the bus. Clinging to the frame of the window for dear life, I took one last look at the dark entity that was hurtling towards me. Then, I dropped to my feet on the road. I sprinted away from the bus. Adrenaline fueled me onwards. I didn't look back. I just kept running. At the speed I traveled, I think it only took me a few minutes to reach the warm and welcoming lights of civilization. I looked at my phone and cried when I saw that I had service. I booked a taxi. I wanted the farthest possible destination. I chose Manchester. Then I took the first train to London. For the past couple of weeks, I've been living in a hotel. I know I was a little late, but I finally took the advice of that online stranger. I moved away. I moved far away. I don't go outside at night, and I definitely don't look out the window after 3 a.m. For her birthday, I took my girl Katie to Arizona so we could stay with some friends of hers and spend a few weeks partying and getting crazy and stuff before heading back to school for the year. We drove up in my dad's car. It's a really old Ford make, and it's pretty beat up. The road there was bumpy and long. Our relationship seemed at its strongest on the road. We were really in love. That was the first time I realized that I had never truly been in love before. We were about halfway there when we realized we were going to run out of gas long before the nearest petrol pump. Katie's head was out of the window, sunglasses on in the blistering heat outside. Nothing but the wild desert landscape to be seen in all directions. We became frantic. We hadn't seen another car on the road in almost an hour. What if we broke down out here, in the middle of the desert, with no food or water, with no one out there to find us? We sped up slightly, driven by these fears. It was then that we came across a gas station, smack bang in the middle of nowhere, in dry, empty nowhere. It was an old, worn-down servo. Long yellow grass blew in the breeze beneath it. Outside were 2 rusted gas pumps. At first, we didn't know if it was occupied. It seemed so lifeless. But as we pulled up and saw the petrol stains in the dirt, we were convinced otherwise. Katie started refilling the car and I went inside to pay and grab something to eat on the road. When I first went to open the door, it jammed. This perturbed me, so I looked up at the sign to check and was reassured that the store was open. According to the torn sign that hung in between the dull yellow curtains at the door window, I pushed harder and harder with effort to get into the shop. Inside, it was totally abandoned and left to ruin. Complete aisles lay on the ground. The fridges were smashed and glass coated on the floor. Despite the brightness outside, the interior of the gas station was dark and bitterly cold. Then there came, from behind me, this quiet weeping, like a child's. I felt my heart race. It was coming from the back room. I stepped over the smashed glass and twisted metal remnants on the floor, over where the patches of grass had grown through. I ran my hand along the wall and felt the crisscross of ivy beneath my fingers. It was overgrown. There came the crying again, and now it was facing the back room door. It was directly in front of me. I pushed the door open, and it creaked with rust in its joints. Inside, there lay several wooden steps into the basement. It was pitch black, and the smell was horrific. The drip drop of water alerted me to the fact that the basement was flooded. The water was up to my knees. Again, there came the crying, and a small splash in the far corner of the basement. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" I started approaching the corner. The smell was horrible. The cold water eventually got to me. The sobbing was getting louder. In the corner, I swore I saw something move amongst the shadows. "Hello?" I called again. "What's wrong?" I finally reached the corner. Still dark, I had to bend down to avoid the pipes, which leaked down my back and trickled down my spine. The figure in front of me was very small and black, hunched over, sobbing quietly, head in its hands. "Why are you down here?" I whispered. Then, it stopped moving completely. It was totally still. All noise seemed to cease, all except for the quiet dripping of a broken pipe somewhere behind me. I outstretched my arm to touch its tiny shoulder, but it then began to slowly turn in my direction, to look me eye to eye. As its face swiveled around to look into mine, I remember screaming and swinging my head up in recoil, cracking it on the pipes up above. The face was white as a sheet, pale like a hideous moving mask. The eyes and mouth were completely black holes, huge and widening even as I looked at them. They were so huge, they almost consumed its entire face. As I desperately tried to escape, it splashed towards me at rapid speed, uncurling its long, thin fingers. It was wailing now, staring into me with its huge black eyes. And as I scrambled up the stairs with great difficulty, as I felt my legs begin to give way beneath me, it sprinted out of the water and up the stairs towards me. I slammed the door, flipped the lock, and tore out of the store, into the old Ford. Katie began to laugh when she saw me, jeans wet, trembling with sweat soaking my chest. But I grabbed her and screamed at her to drive. For about half an hour, I could barely tell her what happened in the store. She listened and gave me a look of sheer horror. When I finally gave in and told her everything, she pulled the car to the side of the road and began to cry herself. I asked her what was wrong. she said. "I saw something while you were gone. When you were in the store, I was just putting the pump back when I saw this little girl. And a man, her father, I guess. The father stared at me with blank eyes and a hanging jaw. But the girl, oh God, the girl, she was just staring straight at me, grinning with this huge smile that stretched so far across her face. I couldn't see any hair on her, and her skin was so dark. Not dark like a black girl, but dark like a shadow. And her smile just shone through the window. I convinced myself that it was a trick of the eye and looked away. When I looked back, they were gone. Then a while later, you came back out." It was dusk by now. We had nowhere to stay. We had not traveled nearly as much as we hoped that day, and the nearest motel meant going back past the gas station. So we just drove up from the roadside where we were, into the clearing a little way up, where people camp sometimes. We had obviously come the night after a big party. There was broken glass everywhere. When we arrived, however, it was empty. After a while, I tried to reassure her that we were okay. I calmed her down, put my arms around her, and we started to kiss. I moved to get closer to her, when she suddenly screamed like hell itself. "It's her! It's her!" she screeched, fumbling to start up the engine. I turned in time to witness a small black face, grinning literally ear to ear with only darkness inside. It was crawling into the car through my open window, with its limbs splayed out like an insect. It had too many limbs, way too many long arms, the fingers filling my face like antennae. We sped off back down onto the road. Back on the road, nothing seemed right. There were no stars. That was what I noticed first. I was too shaken to think much of it, but there were no clouds that could be blotting them out. There was just the vast night sky, devoid of all light. Then, a few minutes after we had been driving forward, still sweating and breathing heavily, we passed the gas station. My heart skipped a beat. The gas station was at least half an hour away, in the opposite direction. All the lights were on, and I saw the door sliding open. As we shot past it, Katie was in such hysterics she found it hard to keep driving. We stopped the car in the middle of the desolate road. I decided we should switch seats so that I could drive. She shuffled across from her seat to mine, and I opened the door to get out. As soon as I was outside, the foul stench of the basement overwhelmed me. I gagged, then vomited down the side of the car. It was then I noticed the runner, a pale white thing, sprinting towards us through the fog, its limbs practically a blur. I could make out no face. How long had it been following us, running after us in the night? I got into the driver's seat as quickly as possible. We drove off again, not talking. Katie whimpered and I simply prayed. Then we passed the gas station again. The door was open now. There were two figures standing at the door, waiting. As we forced ourselves on, we both became aware of a soft, barely audible weeping in the back seats. Neither of us dared to turn around. "Ignore it," I whispered. My trembling hands gripped the steering wheel. Katie was curled in the fetal position, holding her head in her hands. The wailing increased, becoming extremely loud, ear-piercing and horrific. Finally, I ordered myself to end it and looked behind me. For a split second, I thought it was a girl in a white dress looking back up at me, but she was gone as soon as she had appeared. I checked the seats carefully. There was nothing. In my tiredness and fear, I had completely lost track of the road. I drove on, and all through the night Katie whimpered. I touched her once, but she screamed. I never tried again after that. The noises from the back seat started up again. We passed the gas station twice more. The people at the door were closer and clearer every time. The finest slither of red light had begun to settle on the horizon. It was still dark as hell, but at least I was able to see the road ahead of me now. Katie had been silent. face concealed under her hands for some time. I decided to check the time, so I turned on the radio. At first, there was only static. Instead of time, or anything at all, the digital clock simply appeared black. I fiddled with the dial, trying to change the station. In between the static, I found only one audible channel. It had a high-pitched buzz in the background. A man was muttering names and numbers under his breath. 29, Lucy, 30, Adam, 31, Katie. I switched back to static. I knew which name was next. When we got to Katie's friend's house, it was morning. It was overcast and everything had the smell of rain on it. Her friends weren't home. Katie's friends lived way out in the country, with no one else around in a mile. The grass was climbing up the walls outside. How long have they been out? As soon as we were inside, Katie started whimpering again. I realized that while she had been silent, she was biting on her lip. Blood was trickling down her chin, and the skin around her mouth was torn and chewed through. She grabbed the newspaper and some masking tape off the table and began blocking out the windows. After the night's events, I didn't know whether I would be insane to join her or stop her. I simply watched. She covered the windows, jammed the door, and turned the lights off. For some time, it could have been minutes or hours, we sat silent in the dark. I offered to turn the television on. Katie said nothing, sitting blank and comatose. I turned the television on anyway. A grainy black and white image flickered to life before us. A white face with empty eyes and an impossibly huge smile flashed up. The smile growing wider and wider the longer we stared into it. There came the sound of weeping. From the television, or in the house. I couldn't tell. We turned off the TV. It's been 3 whole days now. I haven't seen Katie at all today. She spends her time in the closet, crying. I once tore the door open and screamed at her. She screamed back, her face contorting into something grotesque, something inhuman. I slammed it in her face. The phone rings often. A voice, my mother's I believe, whispering under its breath. I can only catch snippets of what it says. Come back. You're always welcome back. Sometimes in the background I hear quiet chuckling. I hang up without saying a thing. Usually. The bathroom is shining white. I hear the shower running and will walk in to find nothing. Nothing at all. Then, when I'm in the bathroom, I'll hear the television flick back on. It always goes to the face. In the background there are muttering voices now. I've called the police. Twice. All I get is the whispering woman's voice. I called Katie's friends too. Just as fruitlessly. There are knocks at the door a lot now. Through the newspaper, on the other side of the window, I see their hands slam against the glass and slide down. They do this for hours on end sometimes. They press their eyes up to the glass, through the holes in the newspaper. At night, we hear screaming from the guest room. I boarded it up. Sometimes I find tiny pieces of glass on the ground. A leak sprang up about a day ago in my room downstairs. Black spots of mold have appeared on the walls. There is a smell throughout the house, seeping in from my room. The odor of decay. I pray hopelessly, and I wish, I swear to God, I wish that I had never gotten out of that car. I got a job in San Diego not too long after the pandemic settled. It was an exciting time, but I was also anxious about finding a place to live. I didn't have that much saved up, so I had to find somewhere a bit more lenient to newcomers. I signed up to all kinds of lists and tenant groups, but most leads were dead in the water. The only place within my price range had a no pets policy, and I couldn't bring myself to rehome my cat Marmalade. Poor thing was just a year old, and a complete mama's girl. After weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a landlord with a vacant spot. He hadn't even got time to list it. All I'd seen was a post about a cheap apartment. I messaged him spontaneously and asked about it. Turns out, the previous tenant had passed away. It was on the 4th floor, not too far off Main Street, and surprisingly cheap. Cat-friendly too. He offered me a deal. If I paid for the cleanup crew, the place was mine. I couldn't say no. Once the place was cleaned up, I met up with my new landlord and got the keys handed to me. My new place was on the top floor of this beautiful old building made somewhere back in the 50s. Cool stone-tiled floors, spacious ceilings, and plenty of sunlight coming in from the body-sized windows. There was a sort of French balcony with a little place to smoke or have a mini garden. There was a large living room area, a tiny kitchenette, and a cramped little bedroom on the sunny side. It wasn't much, but I could see myself growing attached to it. You could tell it was old though. There were all kinds of little quirks. A lock that you had to jiggle, pipes that rumbled a little whenever you took a shower, and you could immediately tell if one of your neighbors were smoking because of the shitty ventilation. It was far from perfect, but for that price, at that location, I couldn't ask for a better deal. The one thing that dated it more than anything else, however, was the strange 70s wallpaper. This intricate floral pattern covered most of the living room, along with the western wall of the bedroom. A dark gray base color with lines of white, roses, tulips, sunflowers, all in variations of silver and blue. It was beautiful, in a sort of primitive Art Deco kind of way, but you could tell it was old. I promised myself I'd get it replaced if I were to live there long term. It didn't take too long to move in. I didn't have much in the way of furniture, and I didn't really have the money to bring in something new. I figured I'd settle for what little I had for the time being, instead focusing on getting used to my new job. I was working as a full-time consultant for a telecom company, mostly focusing on process management and evaluation. Might not sound that interesting, but you get a lot of wiggle room to really switch things up for the better. Post-pandemic, we were on routine for a single weekly meeting and the rest could be done from our home office. It felt kind of dumb to force people to come in once a week just because. But if I wanted the job, that was the deal. Marmalade got settled in that place long before I did. She found a sunny spot next to one of the big windows. I set up a cozy basket for her to snuggle into. I, on the other hand, was having trouble sleeping for the first few nights. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. I'd lost myself in that view, sort of like when you're looking down into dark waters. You can't really see where it ends. It's just this perpetual nothingness, and you can imagine it continuing forever. That first week went by in a flash. I had my first meeting and got my first assignment, process assessment at one of the branch offices in Pittsburgh. Long distance, with an in-person evaluation at the end of the 2-month cycle. Nothing I couldn't handle, but said office had a sort of reputation for being unmanageable. It was the kind of assignment you throw at someone to see if they got the chops for it long term. That first day was mostly meet and greets, with a tiny after-work event at one of the downtown bars. It was mostly an excuse to crack a few cold ones on a Monday. My new colleagues were a few decibels louder than I was used to, so I ended up sitting mostly in the background, learning to appreciate a small label dark pumpkin ale. The next day, I was in full work mode. I set up my laptop with a view of my awful wallpaper to make it look a bit more office-like. Marmalade wasn't moving from her new favorite spot by the window, so there were no fluffy tails in the way of my webcam. I had a long talk with the branch manager, along with a few technicians, to just sort of dip my toe in the water. They were all courteous though, but I could tell that they'd been through the ringer a couple of times. This wasn't their first assignment, and it wouldn't be their last. By the end of the day, I was talking with one of the salesmen, a woman named Deirdre. At that point, I'd been in constant Zoom calls for over 4 hours, and my voice was giving out. Deirdre could tell I was exhausted, and we ended up just talking about other things instead. My apartment, my job, my cat. I had to bother Marmalade a bit to show her off. Deirdre showed off her own feline companion, a 3-year-old ragdoll named Popeye. Ironically, that call ended up being my longest, but it went by the fastest. Deirdre was a gem. I spent most of my time settling up questionnaires and mapping out the overall structure. I was in daily calls, bouncing emails all the way down the supply chain, trying to get a clear picture of the main issues. It was the same old story that I'd heard 100 times before. Management blaming the salesman blaming the warehouse, and the warehouse blaming the technicians. There were little hitches all the way down the road, ranging from dated inventory systems to useless red tape. After the first few days, I started getting into a routine, ping-ponging between meetings and Excel spreadsheets. Marmalade and I made the apartment into a proper home. Chinese takeout boxes started lining the kitchenette, and I had a few extra talks with Deirdre just to pass the slow hours. I started getting used to that place, even the awful wallpaper. I stopped hearing the rumbling pipes after a while, and the cigarette smoke from the neighbors slowly blended into the background smells. I stopped waking from the cars passing on the streets below, and my first paycheck went into making the living room look like something that could actually be lived in. I remember one night when I was working overtime. I got a late email about submitting a progress report, so I had to stay up making a presentation. I found myself by the opinion that this was looking more and more like a management issue. Who the hell sends that kind of email at 4:50 p.m. on a Thursday, expecting it to be done before lunch the next day? Unbelievable. I was done by about 10 p.m. when I shambled away from my laptop. I picked up a can of cat food for Marmalade and walked over to her favorite window. Only she wasn't there. Her bed was still there, but Marmalade had moved to another window, still sleeping soundly, but she'd found a new favorite spot. It felt strange in a way, like the entire apartment had shifted a little. Looking up at the wallpaper, I could have sworn the patterns had moved. It looked identical, just a bit off. I could have sworn it was different, despite looking exactly the same. It was a strange feeling. Everything felt familiar, but that one little twist made it feel like a new room. I was starting to doubt myself. When looking at Marmalade out of her basket, however, it was clear that something was different, in some way. The next few days, I started to notice this shift in new ways. The walls would look different at night, where at one point I'd see a sunflower, I'd see a rose the next day. Then again, I wasn't ever really sure, and I chalked it up to me just not paying attention. Marmalade would move from spot to spot, never really sure what her favorite ever was. One night, she couldn't settle in at all, instead moving from one window to the next, meowing at me anxiously. That night as I lay awake, I had my eyes firmly fixed on the wall. I could imagine the patterns moving on their own, the many flowers gently swaying to an invisible wind. It was just that kind of unreal surrealist thought you catch just before you fall asleep. But in that moment, I could have sworn it was real, living even. As I closed my eyes, I could imagine the dark gray background color to be as deep as an ocean, a darkness stretching into a distant nothing. The next day, as I was making my morning coffee, I noticed something peculiar. I stepped on a dry blue petal. I couldn't explain where it came from. I had no flowers in my apartment, and the ventilation was so shit that it could barely rotate air. Flower petals were out of the question. Marmalade played with it for a while, and I convinced myself that it was just something I dragged in. Still, it reminded me of a flower petal from the blue roses on the wallpaper. It made me anxious, but I couldn't figure out why. What was I even worried about? I couldn't let that thought go for the rest of the day. That I was missing something obvious, or maybe that there really was something to my strange paranoia. So at the end of the day, when I talked to Deirdre, I brought it up. I explained that there was just something inherently creepy about living here. like an uncomfortable thought tickling your neck when you're not looking. Deirdre tried to reassure me, her chuckle coming through my headphones. "It takes time, love," she said. "You just got there. Besides, everything looks strange in the dark." "Yeah, I just can't shake the feeling, you know," I explained. "Like there's something more to it." "Like what?" I didn't know what to answer. As I stepped into the living room, I noticed Marmalade rolling over the living room carpet, casually playing with another blue petal. Turning on the light, I could see more of them. Over a dozen dry blue petals lining the edge of the wall. Finally, I could tell I wasn't going crazy. This wasn't a one-time deal. That was real. Marmalade didn't seem to mind it though. "I'm gonna have to get back to you," I told Deirdre. "Something just came up." As the call ended, I started scooping up the petals by hand. The moment my knees hit the floor, there was a power surge. It was all so quick. A flash to black. Marmalade hissed, looking straight past me, and I could hear a rustling noise, like a large animal moving through a bush. As quick as it had come, it went, leaving only a startled cat in my elevated pulse behind. The lights were slapped back on with a click, blinding me. Marmalade retreated behind the couch as I picked up the rest of the petals. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the many patterns, petals in hand. I could imagine the gray sinking deeper and deeper, showing me something past the obvious. Like one of those images you have to look cross-eyed to see the truth. I had the same sensation, like I was missing something obvious. I could imagine hearing things, deep in an imagined forest. I could hear branches snapping. I could imagine the blue flowers swaying in the wind. And somewhere in all that depthness dark, something roamed, something looking for an exit. At some point, I snapped to attention. There was a loud electrical noise, an alarm. It was already morning. For some alien reason, I'd been stuck there for hours, just staring at the hypnotizing patterns. An entire night's rest, gone. It wasn't until I stepped away that I realized just how exhausted I really was. My legs had locked on place, kneeling me over straight to the stone-tiled living room floor. Marmalade rushed over, worried about the sudden development. I spent a few minutes just sitting there, calming myself down. The ringing from my cell phone was going strong, trying to give me enough time to shower before my first morning meeting. And yet, I just sat there, slowly petting my cat, my eyes bobbing in and out of sleep, my body deprived. Where'd I been all night? What had I seen? I barely made it through that day, having a 45-minute nap over lunch. By the time I finished my last interview, I was a shell of my old self, barely conscious. I filled Marmalade's food and water bowl and crawled into bed with all my clothes still on. The moment I closed my eyes, I could hear something in the distance. In the half-world between sleeping and waking, I heard breaking branches, owls taking flight, and something large approaching. And despite I knowing I was well and truly alone, my body screamed at me to wake, to have one more look, just in case. I did. I forced my eyes open. Something sharp scratched against the stone-tiled floor, something retreating in haste. A trail of dry petals leading up to the side of my bed. After a night of dreamless sleep, I woke up to choking on something. It took me almost a full minute to cough up a blue petal, several of which had been sprinkled throughout my bed. I could have sworn the wallpaper looked a bit lighter, as if several flowers were looking sparse. The whole wall looked a bit darker. That morning I'd had enough. I called in sick and brought out my toolbox. I started scraping off the wallpaper, piece by piece, across the entire apartment. I made a day of it, listening to music as Marmalade looked at me curiously. Every illustrated petal and stem dropped to the floor, cut by cut, like trimming a paper garden. By the end of the day, My wall was laid bare, revealing nothing but black lead painted concrete underneath. That night, after a long shower, I went to sleep with wallpaper remains still lining the edge of the room. Finally, I could focus. I could look past the hypnotizing patterns. It was done. Gone. Over. Except it wasn't. As I went to sleep, my eyes drifted to the barren walls. A black, eternal night, now unhindered by what little paper-thin barrier had been erected. Just looking at it gave me that feeling in my stomach, like I was falling forward. Even closing my eyes felt brighter than staring into it, like it was more than a color, a place. At some point in the night, I heard this loud howl. Looking up, I could see Marmalade sitting at the edge of my bed, staring straight at the wall, hissing and raising her heckles. Looking straight ahead, I saw something. There, deep in the dark of the bare wall, something moved. I swooped up Marmalade, who clung to my shoulder like a parrot. I threw on my pants, shirt, and got my bag. I'd had enough. I wasn't about to stick around to find out the depths of what was either my own insanity or something unnatural entirely. I didn't want to know. As I entered the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Every single wall had turned to midnight black. The windows had fogged up from the inside, blocking the moonlight from peeking in. I ran my hand along the wall, looking for the door. Something cold bumped against the palm of my hand. A finger. I recoiled, almost dropping Marmalade in surprise. I couldn't see my door. As I looked around, trying to find my bearings, I slowly came to the realization that nothing was quite as it should be. The kitchenette was further away. The windows were further apart. The proportions of the room were off, and seemingly shifting every time I blinked. It was as if everything in that darkness was untrue, malleable, subtly shifting as I looked away. And so I was, looking down at my hands. They seemed different with every blink of my eye. They could be older, younger, scarred, masculine. It was impossible to tell. It was just diffuse enough for an anxious mind to fill in the blanks. But it felt like more than that. It wasn't just a fear of the dark. It was the dark changing me. Finally, I fumbled my way to the front door and pulled it open. And there was nothing. Just a solid black nothing. The apartment was getting darker. Even the windows were turning black. The kitchen sink was running, pushing forth dark nondescript globs, all of which had this peculiar chemical smell. Ammonia? Marmalade was freaking out. She clung to me, digging her claws into my shirt, hissing at something in the dark. Whenever I turned around, the room would look different, swallowed further and further by the night. I could see vague silhouettes, hands reaching forward, some small, some impossibly large. I could imagine creatures the size of skyscrapers, towering forward, impish little beasts nipping at my heels. I curled into a ball on the floor, clutching Marmalade close to my chest. Together, we stared down anything and everything creeping closer. But I was losing. My light was dying. It was all going dark. Then I felt a rumble. I'd forgotten my phone was still in my pants. Bringing it forward, I had a new message from Deirdre. The little screen lighting up a little bubble around me. I wasn't even on the floor anymore. I was sitting on a pile of dry grass and blue petals, and I could see the edge of a dead field stretching out around me in all directions. A wind cut through me like cold glass, and there really were things moving out there. Some big, some small, all vague and horrifying, waiting for me to look away long enough to take shape. "Hey hun, I heard you were feeling under the weather, so I just wanted to check in. Get plenty of rest. We'll talk soon." I played it again and again. I filled my head with her voice and my eyes with what little light my phone struggled to provide. I could feel Marmalade's pulse beating against my neck. Something would brush against me, a light kick against my foot, footsteps rushing past. I saw nothing, but they were there, hidden in the dark. "We'll talk soon." Deirdre's message repeated for the 10th time. "We'll talk soon. We'll talk soon. We'll talk soon." I don't know how long I sat there, just waiting for the dark to pass, but nothing came of it. The battery was dying. As it reached the final few percentages of power, there was little left for me to do. The light was shrinking. I couldn't hear Deirdre's message anymore. Marmalade was yowling like crazy, hissing and striking at something unseen. As the screen died, I felt the chill of the world descend on me, in the silence, and I could feel something approaching, something careful and calculated. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, smiling at me, leering, eager. I was panicking. My skin felt like ice, and I couldn't feel my fingers. I held Marmalade close to me, and in a last-ditch effort, I flung my phone into the dark. Glass shattered. I'd thrown it through the window next to the little French balcony. A beam of morning light broke through. I turned around to an empty apartment, the layout exactly as I'd remembered it, the kitchenette still running, torn down wallpaper lining the edges of the room, Marmalade's favorite bed still by the window, and the many Chinese takeout boxes still left unattended, just as it should be, except every inch of the room was covered by dry blue flower petals. Needless to say, I didn't stick around for long. I moved out to the branch office where Deirdre worked and ended up staying there. We're still best friends to this day. I haven't been able to talk to a lot of people about what happened that night. I get the sense that whatever lived in that dark space was just waiting for someone to tear down that barrier, the hedge of flowers and patterns, something waiting to pull me into a dark space, never to return. Poor Marmalade hasn't been the same ever since. Her fur has turned matted orange, and she's a lot clingier than before. She's okay though. She's a happy cat, but it would be a lie if I say she hasn't changed. The same can be said about me. It's not a single obvious thing, but I feel like there are things about me that aren't the same. My eyes look darker, my fingers look longer, my teeth sharper and wider, just enough for me to notice and remember. In my new place, I sleep with the lights on. I try to not look closely at the wallpaper, just in case. Sometime in 1998, when I was 6 years old, my parents called for my siblings and I to have a seat at the dining room table. I have 2 siblings, an older brother and a younger sister. With somber looks on their faces, my mother and father informed us of our grandmother's passing. Naturally, we all started wailing. All of us except my older brother, that is. He was clearly upset, but he wasn't crying. My sister and I noticed this, but decided not to inquire him. After about 15 minutes, our parents decided to send us to bed early, but not before a prayer. Our family prayed every single night. The thing is, I don't recall who we were praying to exactly. We never went to a church or a temple. We only prayed to someone or something that my parents referred to as our Savior. After our prayer, we showered and went straight to bed. My brother and I shared a room, sleeping in a bunk bed, while my sister had her own room. I climbed up to the top bunk and dove under the covers to resume my bawling. My brother, however, sat up in bed, staring into space. "I don't believe this. Grandma went on the road trip with us. he said with no emotion, probably talking to himself. I now realized the significance of that statement. A few weeks prior, during our Passover break from school, my family went on a road trip. It was a drive to a campsite in the countryside, about 110 miles away from our town. Our grandmother had joined us for the trip, but I have now realized that she never came home with us. The trip was nothing spectacular. It lasted about 2 hours. From the duration of the trip, I was focused on my Game Boy and didn't pay much attention to anything else. The memories are blurry, but I somewhat remember my grandmother sleeping for the whole trip. My father asked my mother something to the effect of, "Did you give her the medicine?" right before we left. As soon as we arrived at the campsite and got settled in, I decided to rest in my tent for a while. As soon as the darkness fell upon the countryside, my mother tapped on the sealed flap to my tent. I unzipped it, only to see her face, completely void of any emotion. She beckoned for me to come over to the front of the tent, to which I obliged. "Your dad and I are going to do something with Grandma. Do not follow us, or I'm afraid you'll be left behind." Despite her cold and callous voice, I let out an oblivious chuckle. I thought that the last part was just a silly joke. I shook my head, and my mother left. I'm not sure how I didn't notice my grandmother's sudden disappearance. No one acknowledged her absence. No one even mentioned what our parents told us the previous night. We just went about our holiday. The anniversary of her death just passed, and I quickly made these realizations. I feared the worst, but I wanted confirmation and closure. I haven't seen my parents in years, but I always trusted my brother. I called him that day and asked him what had happened. His voice grew grim, and he was silent for a few moments. He asked me to write down everything he said, to which I did. He slowly read out coordinates to some place and abruptly hung up. I searched up the coordinates on my GPS. They were the coordinates of the campsite I had visited as a child. Overwhelmed with fear of what had happened to my grandmother 18 years ago, I jumped into my car and began the long drive to the campsite. Upon arrival, I ran into the wooded area surrounding the now abandoned site. I searched for hours, seeing if I could find anything. Shortly before I was about to give up, I found myself in a small clearing. I saw 2 stones, each having a patch of dirt in front of it. I dropped to my knees and cried. I finally figured out what had happened. Feeling weak, I crawled over to the 2 graves. I picked up the first stone, holding it close to my face. I read out the 4 words crudely carved into it. "For you, my savior." I was sure that this was the final resting place of my grandmother, but I wondered why there was another grave. Using the last of my strength, I heaved the stone up to eye level and read the only 2 words that were carved into it. I was unsure as to who the grave was for, but I have just now realized it was meant for me. The 2 words on the small stone were words that my mother said to me during that fateful vacation. Left behind.